Hello, everybody. Welcome back one more time. This is episode 18, and today we're going to talk about profit maximization in more detail. So, the last couple of episodes, we were talking about costs and productivity and how those were part of the story about profit maximization. You learned about, all the different costs last time, average cost, marginal cost, and how that all related to the productivity stuff we did earlier in last week's video lectures. Today, we're going to talk about profits a little more in detail. And just to refresh your memory, economic profits, of course, are the difference between the total revenues that a business brings in, its sales, and its total economic costs. Now, we spent a lot of time the last couple of video lectures talking about these. So these should be something that you have a good basic understanding of. But what we need to talk about, starting with this episode, is the story of total revenues. If you're running a business, your sales revenue for your product is the number of units you produce times the price you sell each one for. So if you sell 1,000 units and you charge $10 a piece, then the story's your total revenue is $10,000. That's really straightforward. But the question that we have to address is what kind of control does your business have over that price that you can charge for your product? And the answer is, my favorite answer of all, it depends. It depends upon what the nature of the market is in which your business, your firm operates. Is it really, really competitive? If so, you don't have any control, perhaps, over the price, or maybe just a little. Is it one where you have monopoly power, monopoly control? There are no competitors. Or is it somewhere in the middle? And so in this lecture, actually in the coming lectures for this week, and also in the next 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to talk a lot more about these different market structures and the degree of control over price. So that's our topic coming up. Before we do that, just a quick little review there on your notes, and that is that we want to talk about the goal of maximizing profits for your business. And how do businesses in general go about doing that? Well, at the bottom or the middle of the sheet there, is just a reminder of what we did last week. And that is, remember that I sold dollar bills, virtually anyway, and said, hey, I've got a dollar bill here in my pocket. Would you be willing to pay 50 cents for this? And your answer was, yeah. Because if you look at that first bulleted point, the marginal revenue, marginal means additional again, the marginal revenue to you was greater than the marginal or additional cost. A dollar to you of revenue for only 50 cents of additional cost said what? Well, it said that your profits were increasing. So you want to fill in that blank. Profits are increasing when marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost. So the firm could actually make more profit by producing more. That's the second blank. So hey, the old adage, if there's money on the table, take the money off the table. And the rest of that says, hey, keep on taking it off the table, right, until there's no more left. So if marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, keep on going. I said, hey, I'll sell you $1 for 75 cents. Would you take that one too? And your answer last week was, you're dang right? Because the extra revenue of $1 was greater than the extra cost of 75 cents. And so your profits increased by an extra quarter. And you said, yeah, I'll take a quarter too. I mean, I took the 50 cents in the first one. I'll take the other quarter because then I get 75 instead of just 50. So you keep on going until there's no more money on the table. Likewise, if we were in a situation where I said, I'll sell you $1, but it's going to cost you more than that. So your extra cost was more than your extra revenue. I'll give you $1, but it's going to cost you $1.25. You said, no, thanks. Because if you did that, you were in a situation where your profits were decreasing. So that's the next blank there. And if that's the case, you'd actually have more profits if you produce less. The old adage is don't put any money back on the table. So if you cut back and don't do that, you're going to actually have higher total profits. So profits would be increased if you would produce less. The conclusion of this, of course, is that when marginal revenue equals marginal cost, when I'm going to give you $1 for exactly $1, right? Then you say that's where I stop. That's the point where profits are maximized. Because at that point, there's no more money to take off the table, and I'm not putting any back on. I want to stop there. So for the second part of that, then firms are producing the profit maximizing level. So profits are maximized, firms are producing the most and the best that they can, the profit maximizing level. So that's the general rule, just kind of as a refresher from last week. And of course, the question is, how much control does your business have over the price and over the marginal revenue? And they're not always the same, as we'll learn in the coming weeks. But how much control does your business have? And so what I want to do then is to turn to the next page, if you would. To hear about the guy who ate yeast and shoe polish for breakfast. You know why? Yeast and shoe polish for breakfast. You wanted to rise and shine. Sorry. But if you turn at the next page there, on the top of page 2, we're going to talk about in economics the idea that there are 4 basic market structures under which firms operate, ranging all the way from competition that is so ultra strong that we call it perfect competition, to the other extreme where a market is dominated by a single firm, and we call that pure monopoly, and then a couple of market structures in between. And so we're going to talk about real-world businesses as lying along a continuum. And on the far left here, for our sake purposes, I'm going to talk about what economists call perfect or pure competition. That's going to be the topic of the other video lectures for this week, but I want to just right now do a brief introduction of all 4 of them to kind of give you a framework for interpreting what we're going to be doing. So if you turn to page 3, I know we didn't fill in the rest of the continuum. We'll come back to this in just a second. Page 3 has a handy-dandy chart, and this is a really important chart. This puts in one page a summary of all of the defining characteristics of all 4 market structures, how they relate to each other, what their profits will look like, how they charge prices versus production across the structures, etc. This is a really important page, so definitely spend a bunch of time on this. It's not hard, but you definitely need to have mastery over these concepts because then you can apply the terms more fruitfully. So what do we mean by perfect or pure competition? We'll look at the second column there where it says perfect or pure competition. Here's what we mean by a market that is perfectly competitive. First of all, the number of firms, a very large number of businesses. A perfectly competitive has a lot of businesses. And each of them really is small, right? Each of them is only a drop in the bucket of the total industry output, right? Each is a tiny little player in the overall picture of that industry. What kind of product are they producing? Identical. Completely identical, homogeneous, standardized for all the firms. Nobody's producing different stuff. They're all producing exactly the same thing. How much control does one individual firm have over the price he or she can charge for their product? And the answer is zip. They are a price taker, not a price maker, right? What that means is whatever the market determined price is for that good or service, that commodity, the story is that individual firm has to charge that price, and we'll talk about an application here in just a second. The ease of entry of new firms, characteristic number 4. Very, very easy. There are no big barriers. There's nothing keeping new firms from coming in, old firms from leaving, and all of that. There aren't any patent rights, and there aren't any economies of scale like we talked about last week. There aren't any government protections that insulate those firms from competition, right? It's free and easy entry and exit. And in terms of the role of non-price competition, advertising, there isn't any. Why would you end up spending money when the products are identical? So let me ask you to think for a second in your head, or perhaps what you read in the book, about some examples here of perfectly competitive markets. What'd you come up with? Well, one of the examples that we often give, and I'll talk about this for the current example here, the current example, and I'll do a couple of others, is agricultural markets, right? Agricultural markets. So if you didn't jot that down there, please jot down agricultural markets. Historically, 50, 75, 100 or more years ago, I think this would be a great example. In today's world, there's some stuff going on, obviously, in terms of huge agribusiness operations, mega farms, and all of that, which have really changed the nature of agriculture dramatically in this country and globally. But historically, it's been a great example of perfectly competitive markets, and still today, to some extent, I think it fits somewhat closely. Let's go back and think about it. In fact, let's talk about one perfectly competitive firm, and let's say we're talking about the market for wheat. And we got a good old wheat farmer here. We're going to call him Bob, okay, just to make this kind of fun and memorable. We're going to have names for all the different market structures. Wheat farmer Bob. Why is the agricultural market, the market for wheat, perfectly competitive? We'll go back up to the characteristics list one more time. First of all, historically, very large number of small farmers, right? Everybody was a drop in the bucket. What kind of product were they producing? Same thing, right? A bushel of wheat was effectively a bushel of wheat no matter where you went. And so their product was standardized or homogeneous or identical. How much control did old Bob, our good friend wheat farmer Bob, have over the price he could charge for a bushel of wheat? Zero, right? He had no control whatsoever. He was a price taker. Think about it. If the market for wheat, the overall market said that the price of a bushel of wheat was $2 a bushel, what price was Bob going to charge? $2 a bushel. What if he charged more than $2? He said, hey, you know what? I'm Bob, right? Hey, Bob's wheat's $2.50 a bushel. Come buy from me. What are people going to say? Sorry, Bob, right? I can get wheat from Farmer Mary down the lane for $2. Why would I pay you $2.50? There's nothing special about your wheat just because your name's Bob. And so Bob's not going to win. What if Bob charged less than $2? You might be thinking, well, gosh, he'd gain a lot of market share, but the answer is no, right? He can sell everything he can produce at $2. That's the overall market determined price. If he charges less than $2, he's a fool because he can sell everything he can produce at $2. That will maximize his revenues and therefore maximize his profits because he doesn't control his costs, as we'll see in just a second. How easy was it, number 4, characteristic number 4, for new farmers to come in and start up a wheat farm back in the day? Pretty easy, right? All you needed was 40 acres or 80 acres, a plow, a couple of oxen, or maybe a small tractor or whatever, and the land, obviously, and you're good. I mean, it wasn't that difficult to become a wheat farmer at all. There were no big, mechanical, industrial, huge outlays of capital, expenses to get started, and all that relative to what there are today. So this was a really easy industry to get into, and lots and lots and lots of farmers all over the place. How much, number 5, how much was there a role for non-price competition, like advertising, branding, marketing, location, all that kind of stuff? And the answer is none. Why would wheat farmer Bob spend money on advertising? Say, hey, take a newspaper article or ad out and say, hey, buy Bob's wheat. Why would he do that, right? All that would do is increase his costs, and he can't control his price. So if his revenues are controlled by the market and he just raised his cost, he loses profit. It's like throwing money down the old proverbial rat hole. Why would he do that? So there's no role for non-price competition in truly perfectly competitive marketplace. Can you think of some other examples? Well, some of you might be thinking about really, really, really competitive markets right now. I bet that some of you are thinking like maybe gas stations. And I would say, no, gas stations are not, or convenience stores are not truly perfectly competitive markets. And the reason is because even though there are a lot of them in a big city, and they're producing, similar products, they're not producing exactly identical products. They're not quite the same, right? The story is the type of gas might not be the same in terms of ethanol or not. The story is that, I don't know about you, but PDQ is one of my weaknesses because they got that great bakery. And those sugar-covered cookies are those almond iced, coat frosted. That's what they are. Frosted cookies. Oh, they're my weakness. I keep on telling myself every time I drive by there, I'm not going to turn in. I'm not going to turn in. And I turn in, right? And I get a cookie and I feel bad about it and all that kind of stuff. I'm not completely rational, but the story is, those things are good, right? So anyway, the story is that some have an easier access on and off. Some have a nice car wash and others don't. So the products are very similar, but they're not identical. There aren't very many, if any, truly perfectly competitive markets. We use agricultural markets as a good example historically. I would argue another one you could put down is the market for trading in international currencies. So currency markets. there are people who, as their job, speculate on what's going to happen to the value of the US dollar, for example, against global currencies like the euro or the yen or whatever. And the story is that fits here pretty clearly as a perfectly competitive market because there's a lot of firms, a lot of people that are trading those currencies. The product that they're trading is standardized. The U.S. Federal Reserve notes are standardized goods. The individual control of one trader over the value of the U.S. dollar versus global currencies is darn near zero, right? Almost exclusively zero. How easy is it to get in? Pretty easy. And how much control or how much time would that trader spend on advertising? Say, hey, I'm the great trader. No, I mean, they would just raise their costs again and take away their profits. So that's a great example as well. If you look at the rest of the table, underneath perfect competition, you'll see that they maximize profits by producing up to the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and then they stop. Because like we talked about at the beginning of this episode as well as last time, the story is that at that point there's no more money on the table. They've taken it all off and they don't want to put any money back on the table, so my profits are maximized where MR equals MC. Okay? Their demand curve we're going to see in the next episode. You can come back to this in just a second, but it's perfectly elastic, which you remember from earlier in the class means that Bob faces a demand curve that is horizontal at the market determined price, and we'll see that with some numeric examples coming up shortly in the next episode. The profits that they can make, you can look at, and we'll actually come back to that a little bit later on. So don't worry about this right now, but later on in your review, that'll make a whole lot of sense. So that's what we're going to talk about primarily in the coming episodes this week is Wheat Farmer Bob, what profits look like, and profit maximizing behavior under perfect competition. On the other extreme, if you want to flip back to page 2 real quick and enter this one, on the far right of this continuum is the market structure of pure monopoly, right? Pure monopoly. And so go back to, I know, flipping back and forth, right? Can't make up my mind. If you flip back to the table on page 3, you'll see the characteristics. And we'll go through this really quickly. In a pure monopoly, there's one firm only. That firm is the market. They're the only producer. The product that they're producing is unique. It doesn't have any close substitute. So they've got something that nobody else has, right? Something that sets them apart, which is one of their sources, obviously, of monopoly power. How much control does our pure monopolist have over price? And the answer is a ton, right? We're going to call our monopolist, just for the sake of the name here, Mary, right? Mary the monopolist. Now, she's got a lot of control over price. Can she charge any price she wants for her good or service? Some of you may have said yes, but the correct answer is no. She can't. She can't charge any price she wants. She can only charge the highest price consistent with consumers' willingness to pay, consistent with the demand for that particular good or service. So something that is a necessity people have to have, and Mary has control over. In that case, she could charge a really high price and people wouldn't have any alternative. If she has monopoly power over something that's a luxury, that's not a necessity, the story is when the price gets too high, people would just say, more people would just say, I'm sorry, but I don't need it that much, and would back off. So she can't charge any price she wants. A lot of times people say that. That's not true. What she can do is have considerable control and charge the highest price that the market will bear. How easy was it for new firms to enter? Is it for new firms to enter into a pure monopoly market? Not easy at all. There are lots of barriers. Whether it's that Mary has patents that prohibit competition, whether she has monopoly status granted to her by the government, whether she has big-time economies of scale that mean that new companies can never get big enough to compete with her because she's so big, she's got such low average costs that no new startup can ever make it, no whippersnapper can beat old Mary kind of story, or other sources of monopoly power. So it's very, very difficult for new firms to enter, and that's a key part of the story. Advertising and non-price competition, Mary might do a little bit of goodwill advertising to convince people that she's a kinder, gentler monopoly and not such a big, bad whatever. But the story is that other than that, she doesn't need to advertise really because she has a unique product. She might want to raise market awareness, but generally speaking, she's not going to spend too much doing that. So what are some examples here? you can think of pure monopoly markets. One that you're all aware of is with respect to electric utility companies in this part of the world. You may be in the market for MGE, Madison Gas and Electric, or maybe you're in the market for Alliant Energy. Depending upon what your service area is, that particular company has a monopoly on electric utility provision, right? They're the only provider. Now, they're a privately owned company whom the government has granted the right to be the only provider to, and we'll talk about why they do that later, but in your particular area, they are a monopoly. They're not a monopoly on electric utility generation and provision across the Midwest or across the United States or across the world, but they have pure monopoly power within their particular market. And that's important to think about because, when you talk about pure monopoly or competition, it's a matter of degree. What is the market that we're looking at, right? That's going to tell us whether an individual business has a competitive market or a pure monopoly market. For example, let me just tell you another story. You have to talk about what is the market we're looking at. Pure monopoly. In my hometown of Mineral Point, Wisconsin, southwest part of the state, go Pointers, wrestling champions, and all this pep band geek. So I'm bandy. I like band. Love music. But the story is that back in Mineral Point, there's only one, for example, movie theater when I was a kid, and there was only one funeral home. And only one grocery store for a long time. And so the story is that while, in a broader sense, in the big city, none of those industries have monopoly power. In Mineral Point, they did. They were the only one, right? So whatever the funeral home director was charging for a funeral, you pretty much didn't have much choice unless you wanted to take them to a different town or whatever. And most people didn't want to do that. And so the story was they had a lot of control. In a big city like Madison, of course, there's competition in all those industries, grocery stores and funeral parlors and movie theaters and what have you. And so there's definitely a little bit, at least, not perfectly competitive, for example, but more competition than in good old Mineral Point. Other monopolies you could think about. How about your water company? So your local city, your municipality has one water company, right? It's run usually by the government, almost exclusively by the government, and they're the only provider of water and sewer treatment. And so they have a monopoly. Or when it comes to baseball, professional baseball, the Milwaukee Brewers have a monopoly on professional. Usually they're professional, not last year so much. But the story is that they have monopoly on professional baseball in the state of Wisconsin, right? They don't have to allow other firms to come in and compete with them in the professional ranks in Wisconsin, et cetera, et cetera. So there are examples of pure monopoly power that do exist in our world. How do they maximize profits? We're like everybody else, where MR equals MC. There's no more money on the table to take off. Their demand curve is going to be relatively inelastic. That is that when they raise their price, they're not going to lose much in terms of sales because there's no unique products, right? There's no substitutes out there that are close to what they're producing. And then the rest of it we're going to look at again when we get a little bit later on in the section here, okay, in the course. So that's the two extreme cases. Most businesses in the real world lie somewhere in the middle. And so we're going to talk about two additional market structures if you want to flip back to page 2 and fill these in. We're going to talk about a market structure called monopolistic competition. And we're going to talk about a market structure which is probably a new word to many of you, and that's a market structure called or oligopoly. So monopolistic competition and oligopoly are the other two market structures. So let's flip back to page 3, and we'll talk a little bit about each of those, and then we'll end this episode before really getting into the model of perfect competition in more detail, and then the rest of them in following weeks. So monopolistic competition. A lot of students hate that term, right? Because they look at it, and it looks confusing, right? Well, make up your mind, economists, what the heck, right? Is it monopoly or is it competition? Why would you use both terms in the same term? And you know what? It's not actually that difficult in a couple of ways because you remember from your English class is along the way, right? Which term here is the adjective? Yeah, monopolistic. What's it describing? The competition. So this is very competitive with a little bit of monopoly power, a little bit of control over their market. And another way to remember that is to think about this continuum picture. that monopolistic competition is closer to pure competition than it is to pure monopoly. So when we look at monopolistic competition, a great example here is the restaurant industry in a big city. And so we're going to talk about a restaurateur who runs an Italian pizza joint by the name of Luigi, right? So Luigi, the restaurateur here, is our example for monopolistic competition. Like the restaurant industry in a big city, this industry has many firms, right? So monopolistically competitive markets have many firms. They're producing, number two, this is a key one, somewhat differentiated products, or as it says in parentheses there, they're similar but not identical. And I like that term a lot. So if you think about it, right, in the restaurant industry, there's lots and lots of restaurants that do pizza, for example. And they all produce pizza, but those pizzas are not all exactly the same, right? Some of them are better than others. I mean, Luigi here, right, he's got some special things about his restaurant. His pizza has Mama Pastorini's secret recipe, right? That sauce there is just to die for, and nobody else quite has that. So it's just a specific, unique taste. He's got an ambiance that makes this restaurant really cool, right? It's got a great location. He's got romantic booths and all that kind of stuff, you know, a great violin player in the back playing romantic music. And so a lot of people like Luigi, right? He's got some loyalty, some customer loyalty because of those small things that make him different from his many competitors. How much control does Luigi have over his price? Some, right? He's got some within narrow limits. He doesn't have a lot of control. He can't just charge a really high price. But the story is he's better than Bob in the sense that, you know, if he decides to raise his price for his pizza, let's say 10%, he's not going to lose all sales, right? Some people are loyal to him and they say, you know what? You know, I know there are a lot of other substitutes like Mario's, yeah, across the street. But the story is that Luigi, man, I'm going to come and still buy from you at least most of the time, because I really am loyal. Some people say, no, I'm going to go to Mario's or I'm going to go to you know, somebody else's. But Luigi is going to have a little bit of control over his price. How easy is it for new firms to enter into an industry that's monopolistically competitive? How easy is it for new firms to come and compete? And the answer is pretty easy. You know, it's pretty easy to start up your own restaurant. Not perfectly easy, but there are no huge barriers compared to what exists over here in pure monopoly, right? There usually aren't big patent rights or big economies of scale or other things like that. So for the most part, in this particular market, it's pretty easy for new firms to enter. Do they advertise and do lots of non-price competition in this market structure? The answer is, oh, yeah. They do a ton, right? Tons of money spent advertising and telling people that, hey, our product's just a little bit better. In fact, maybe a lot better than those competitors, whether it really is or not. It's all about keeping that market share and competing, right? And if you don't do it, other people will, and you'll lose. And so the story is that there's a lot of money and a lot of time spent on advertising, marketing, branding, trademarking, location, all these differences to say, hey, we're better than the average restaurant or better than the average whatever. And so there's a lot of focus on doing that. So what are some other examples to jot down? If you didn't jot down in the example box there, the restaurant industry in big cities, I would definitely do that. But what are some other examples that you can think of? Yeah, maybe you're saying, how about hotels in a big city? That's a good one, right? Definitely fits those characteristics. Or, I don't know, I brought an antique with me today. I don't know if you've ever seen one of these. It's called a phone book. Yeah, I know, right? It's pretty cool, huh? I love these things, not because I use them to actually, you know, find people's phone numbers and call, but because they make great tools for going camping, right? You take them and you put them in your wood box, and when you go camping, you just rip out a few pages and everything stays together. It's a lot less messy than doing newspaper, so I love these things. But the story is that if you look at the yellow pages in here, right, on the phone book in a big city like Madison, relatively big city, the story is you're going to see monopolistic competition staring you in the face. So as I flip into the yellow pages here, I see caterers, lots of caterers, not exactly the same, but similar. I see childcare services. I see computer repair services. I see electric contractors, so electricians. I see insurance agents. I see nail salons and manicures. I see roofing contractors, tax consultants, right? Youth organization, well, that's not going to be that one. That was the last one. Window cleaners. You can talk about just about every small business, plumbers, and all that kind of stuff that you see in the yellow pages as great examples of monopolistic competition. It is ubiquitous. It's all over the place, right? When it comes to this market structure, most small businesses lie here. They profit maximize where MR equals MC, and you'll see that their demand curve is relatively, but not perfectly, elastic. Because if they raise their price, they lose a lot of sales, but they don't lose all of their sales, unlike wheat farmer Bob. Okay? So that's monopolistic competition in a nutshell. We'll look at more in detail later. And then the last one here is oligopoly or oligopoly. And we're going to talk about our oligopolist by calling him Ollie. And I'll talk more about Ollie in just a second. But the characteristics are on that table one more time. Oligopoly is a really cool marketplace. It's the most interesting, I think, of all of the market structures in terms of studying behavior. But we'll get to that in a little bit. First thing is that it is an industry characterized by a few firms. And that's key here. Fewness is key. So there's a small number of big players, maybe 4 or 5 or 10 firms that dominate the entire industry, right? They don't control it all necessarily, but they're the big players, the big movers, the big shakers. And so they dominate the market. The product that they're, let me ask you before we go any further, think of some examples. Jump down to number 6. What are some markets you can think of where there's only a small number of big firms that dominate that industry and hence would be classified as an oligopoly? Yeah, maybe you're thinking about commercial airline manufacturing. So really only got 2 big players, right? Airbus and Boeing are the big ones. So that'd be a good example. Or maybe you're thinking about domestic auto producers, right? Don't have that many car companies that make autos in the United States. When we go global, of course, there's a lot of competitors, and that makes the market a little more competitive. But the story is that that would be a good example. Computer hardware manufacturers. You could think about the story of the steel industry or the copper industry, copper mining and sales. Or you could think about the diamond industry. Or you could think about the cement industry. All of those, or cell phone manufacturers, not the service providers, that's more monopolistic competition, but the actual manufacturers of the cell phones, right? Apple and Samsung and stuff like that, that's going to be in this market structure for sure. And so we've got those markets that are dominated by a few firms. What's the type of product that they're producing, though? Well, some of them are standardized, and some of them are differentiated. In other words, if you think about it, right, when it comes to steel and cement and copper, those industries, they produce exactly the same thing. Now, I know there's different grades of steel and all of that, but generally speaking, they produce basically the same product. Whereas car companies and computer hardware makers and cell phone manufacturers and the airline makers produce differentiated products, right? Cars are cars, but they're not all the same. And some have better, fuel efficiency. Some have nicer amenities inside. Some, whatever, right? And so there's lots of different things that make them differentiated. So how much control does each firm, let's say Ollie, have over the price he or she can charge for their product? And the answer is, well, it depends. In fact, this is the most interesting of all of the characteristics here when it comes to oligopoly. There is a temptation here, oftentimes, for these industries, for the firms to actually get in cahoots with each other, to collude with each other, to cooperate and not compete. And if they do that, which is oftentimes illegal, but not always, if they do that, then the story is that they have a lot of control over price, right? However, what oftentimes happens is individual firms in that market say, ooh, if I just cut my prices and nobody else did, I could suck away their market share and I could win. They oftentimes get very, very competitive and their cooperation falls apart. One firm decides to cheat and they all decide to cheat and the whole thing becomes ultra competitive. They get into bidding wars and price wars and all that kind of stuff. And so the control over price here runs the whole gamut. And I think that's the most interesting aspect. We're going to talk about those strategies and the realities of that behavior in coming weeks. There's significant obstacles to entry. It's hard to start up your own car company in the United States. Hard to start up a cell phone manufacturing company. It's hard to start up a copper company, etc. There are big-time barriers to new firms coming in. And when it comes to non-price competition, advertising and all that, let me ask you this way. When was the last time you saw an ad for a copper company? Don't remember when, do you? When was the last time, though, that you saw an ad for a car company? Last time you watched television, right? The story is that there's a lot of role for advertising when it comes to differentiated products. But when there are identical products produced by oligopolists, they don't tend to spend much money on advertising at all. And that makes a lot of sense as well. So hopefully you jotted down some examples of the different oligopoly markets. Do note that they maximize profits just like everybody else. They take money off the table until there's no more money to take off the table, and then they stop because they don't want to put any back on. MR equals MC. And then the rest of the stuff on there about prices and their demand curve isn't going to make a lot of sense yet, but it will later, and then you can come back to this and use it part of your as your review. Okay. So in this episode, a little shorter one, we just looked at the idea of the 4 different types of market structures under which businesses operate and their defining characteristics and their goal, which is to maximize profits. In the next episode, we are going to actually look at Bob and how Bob, as a perfectly competitive firm, tries to maximize his profits and what they will look like. Until then, have a good one. Bye.